So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth session of the ConNext 24 about the interesting and at times challenging topic cleaning. My name is Henning Schulze from the University of Lincoln in the UK.
And I'm Julia Schulz from the University of Applied Sciences and Arts Hildesheim in Germany. We will be hosting the session today. Before we proceed to the presentations, let me remind you of the rules of this and the other sessions. Please make sure your microphone and webcam are turned off so that we don't disturb our presenters during their talks and to save some bandwidth. We encourage you to use the chat box for asking questions or for hints and remarks. We will try to address these in the Q&A sessions. Our sessions will be recorded to share the contributions with a broader audience. This is a conference for and by students, so please respect one another. Only the speaker's exceptional and remarkable effort makes this event happen.
So, welcome to this fifth and final session of ConNext 2024. Because we probably have some new audience members, here's just a short introduction how ConNext came into being and what we would like to achieve. ConNext is a joint effort of the conservation training programs of the universities of Antwerp, Amsterdam, Hildesheim, Cologne, Potsdam, Lincoln, Thomas, Westdean, Delaware, and La Cambre, Paris, all within the field of wood and furniture conservation. Some programs also incorporate polychrome and modern materials, and therefore the partners in ConNext provide a wide variety of subjects. Our ambition is to connect you, the students, with your international student colleagues and to give you the opportunity to share your work and your questions. In our fourth conference, it seems that we are more connected than ever. For this series of ConNext evenings, we have again a large number of participants from educational and research institutes from 12 different countries. Education is paramount for the future of our field, and it starts with sharing your hard work, experiences, and knowledging. Okay, I'm reading from an older script. Then I will keep going until I've done that, and then we'll change the new one. We also hope that aside from ConNext, you will continue sharing during your studies and your professional lives. As the ConNext team, we would hope to build your confidence and experience and encourage you to send in your work for conferences like ICOM, CC, Ebonist, or future talks. So let's make ConNext 2024 an international platform for emerging conservatory restorers to meet and share your knowledge. So now we think you are excited as we are to kick off this session of ConNext, and we are, I can see that it's a slightly different topic. So let's ConNext. Sorry about this. I will return with a better script in a moment. Over to you, Julia.
Yes, thank you, Henning. Yes, it is my honor to introduce today's keynote lecturer, Anke Scharrahs. Anke is a freelance conservator specializing in polychrome wooden objects with a special focus on elaborate wall and ceiling paint panels from the 17th to the 19th century urban palaces from Syria. Her PhD thesis focused on the historical production techniques of these splendid interiors, which I hope to see some today in the lecture. For 25 years, she has been engaged in research and conservation of Syrian interiors, both in museum collection in Berlin, Dresden, New York, Los Angeles, Honolulu, Dublin, Cairo, Doha, and Cincinnati, as well as in historic houses in Damascus and Hama. Her research interests include various aspects of the materials, use, and alteration of these interiors. She has lectured and published widely in her subject, including the book Damascene Ajamite Interiors, Forgotten Jewels of Interior Design, or the book co-authored with Felice Chakir Philippe, Syrian Living Medieval to Modern. Today, she will talk about some aspects of dealing with large-scale, richly decorated wooden interiors using the example of splendid rooms from 17th to 19th century Syria across the world. Anke, thank you for being with us, and the screen is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind introduction Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, because it was still switched off. So I'm really happy to join you today, and yeah, I'm also happy to share some of the thoughts and experiences I gained in the past 25 years, and I hope that some of them is useful and inspiring. And yeah, let's get started. I'm joining in to share some of my insights and experiences that I gained dealing with a group of large-scale objects, as you can see. They are spread out across collections around the world. And the date you can see below the images, it's actually the date of acquisition. So they were actually made in the first place to decorate the most important room of private homes in Syria, in Aleppo, in Damascus, and Hama. And this was the room for the reception of guests. And when these interiors fell out of use in the mid-19th century, there was a keen interest in other regions of this planet to purchase these treasures. And that's why they are spread out today around the globe. So including such remote places like Honolulu or Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And they are richly decorated with a huge variety of patterns, colors, surface decorations, and yeah, the most important decorative feature are these raised gesso ornaments. They are overlaid with metal leaf or tinfoil and then painted with tinted glazes, as you can see it here. And they are called in the conservation world with the Italian term pastiglia. But in the Arab world, they are called ajami. And that's why if you come across the term ajami rooms, it refers to interiors with such decorations. The intention of the artisans was to create surfaces with contrasts between matte and glossy areas, between painted and metal leaf areas, as you can see here in this really well-preserved rare example, as well as here. So that if you move inside such a room, the surfaces would appear like soft textiles. And also the decoration painted on the walls evokes precious textiles that would be also part of the room's furnishings. But these rooms also age, of course, and show a large variety of damages. For example, the corrosion of the tinfoil and copper alloy. So it's quite a change from a silvery surface to almost a black surface on the left side, or from copper alloy that changed entirely green on the right side. But also, of course, all paint layers age and all change their color. For example, the bright red lead turns gray because of a chemical reaction. And quite significant change that is present in almost all of these rooms is the change of these bright blue smalt layers, which is crushed cobalt glass. And when this is covered with later varnish layers, then the color changes from blue to black. And most of the rooms that are displayed in collections around the world, as well as in the houses in situ, they appear in such glossy brown color schemes. And this is because of later applied varnish layers that darken by time. But it's not only an aesthetic issue, it's also like a conservation issue, because the thicker the varnish layers are, when they age, they evolve quite a lot of tension. And as you can see it here, you can really see the brush strokes from applying the varnish, where it's a little bit thicker. And this has so much tension that it delaminates the paint layers. But also later treatment or maintenance during the lifetime of these interiors causes changes as well as quite heavy damages, like this panel. Originally, this panel was covered with tinfoil that we can still see, the silvery surface. And then the entire surface was covered with a yellow glaze to make it appear like a golden surface. And then all the details were painted. But unfortunately, in 1960, the entire interior was cleaned with paint stripper and strong solvents. And because of that, the yellow glaze is almost entirely removed, except below every tiny painted detail. And originally, it was supposed to look like this well-preserved example on the right side from another interior in Damascus. And there's, of course, other cleaning methods with too much water, as you can see here. These rooms were frequently cleaned during their use, still in the house, as well as later when they were transferred to other places. So whenever you work on such an interior, you often have a combination of all these various damages that makes it sometimes quite tricky and important to understand first what you have under your hands. And then, as you can see, these interiors are quite large objects, and it's often the case that you have like well-preserved areas in certain corners and really heavily damaged ones in other corners. For example, because of old water leaks in the ceiling when they were still installed, or because of other reasons, for example, because of the use when it was still in the house. So that areas where people were sitting and leaning against the wall, against the painted wooden panels, they just have more scratches and damages. So it's really important to understand all areas before taking any decision for consolidation, cleaning, or even restoration steps. Because originally they are intended to be really splendid interiors with colorful painted surfaces, as well as combined with real textile furnishings, as you can see here in a contemporary setting. But you can see like a precious carpet, and the cushions and the mattresses would be covered with costly silk weavings from Isfahan, for example. So what we are dealing with, it's like an entire complex creation of an interior, not just the painted wood. And I'd like to share some of my thoughts now, what drives me when working with these interiors, and yeah, how I approach my work on these objects. One thing is, I'm leaving out all the consolidation of flaking paint layers, because this is pretty clear that it's needed in most cases. And I'm jumping now to different methods of in-painting that I use, even in one room, because usually it's not possible to work only with one method. And here it's an example from the famous Aleppo room in Berlin, where I just came from an hour ago. So you can see that after removal of the varnish on the right side, I did an in-painting for the cartouche, for the medallion in the middle, where the colors match. This was a decision taken together with the museum, because the paintings are the only ones that survived from Syria. They are more than 400 years old, and yeah, it's unique. And if you are not used to Persian miniature scenes as these are, then it's sometimes really difficult to recognize what's painted. You will see in the next slide. But I want to draw your attention to the blue background, where you see that the in-painting is still recognizable. So we decided for the backgrounds to leave the paint a little bit lighter. that if you go close, it's easy to see what's in painting. And all the in painting, by the way, is with watercolors. So it's easy to remove it later without harming the original, because the original colors are all water stable binding media. Yeah, here's another example from this room where you can see the damages. And in the next slide, you can see how much of the painted figure is recognizable now again, even the curly hair of the animal. So it was really important for the museum to do this step. But if you go close, you will even find all the in paintings clearly, because they are in deep recesses, because the paint layer is pretty thick. That's why we decided to go for this method. And this is actually the framework for the panels that I've just shown. And here we decided to do in painting for these slim white lines that surround each panel, because the eyes we found get distracted if these lines are always like interrupted, like in the upper image. And only by doing this and doing like some slight in paintings, the eye goes to the important panels and not to the damages any longer. And if you look closer on these inscription panels, for example, you will see another method, or actually it's the same that I introduced already, but the background here, it's a mold, this blue glass pigment. And here we try to imitate the blue color of the damaged areas even, because when matching, if we would match the color of the background, this like grayish, blackish tone shade, the panel would even look black from far distance. So we try to trick the eye by mimicking an characteristic damage of small layers. So this is an overview on the when these panels are mounted to their entire framework. So it's super busy with a lot of decoration, and that's why it's important to always put these pieces together or have them together and then decide what's suitable for which part of the room. And yeah, as I mentioned already, most of these rooms in collections as well as in the original houses have this brown surface appearance, as these examples that are still in Damascus. And I was puzzled a long time why they look so different than the few well-preserved examples that I could find during my research, during my field trips to Damascus. And then I realized, while working on the rooms that are in collections abroad, that it's obviously the interplay between antique dealers that were present in Damascus for 6 decades and who actually fed the international market with interiors, taking them out from the original houses and working together with a local restoration workshop, which was pretty famous, the family Al-Khayat. And so I think we have it often for groups of objects that you have this kind of like players who are responsible for the outcome of the restoration of objects for potential clients. And yeah, this was pretty clear for these interiors from Syria. But in most cases, it's actually possible to remove these later varnish layers, not only because we want to get closer to the original intended color scheme, but also because they evolve more and more tension after decades. So it's also a conservation issue. And sometimes it's even possible to get back to the really bright smalled colors, the blue. Here's an example that I did recently with my team together in the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, in Qatar, where we were quite successful to bring back or to get closer to the original intended brighter color scheme. Here's an example that my colleague in Damascus has carried out recently, and in the beginning it might often look like quite a huge change, but these interiors are really made with high contrasts, and that the interplay between glossy and matte painted areas really is an important feature. Yeah, another example how light the colors below the varnish layers are. Yeah, here another example of like my oldest baby, the room that was found in storage in Dresden and that I worked on for almost 25 years. But not because I'm slowly, it was just lack of funding. But now it's in permanent display for a year now. Yeah, now you can go to the museum and have a look at it. And yeah, I think, or I'm always quite happy if we manage, or if it's possible to bring these varnished rooms a little bit closer to the original intended surface appearance, like this room in Damascus. And this is the room in Doha now on display. And I was very happy about the decision of the curators to even install it and display it together with the textile furnishings that were actually a significant part of the creation in the first place. Because it was rooms made for the reception of guests and of, you know, coming together, enjoying each other's company. And I'm super glad that these rooms have such an appealing character to people until today. And I was told recently that the room in Doha actually is the favorite object of the visitors because they really immediately can, how to say, relate to this living room. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
Anke, thank you for your colorful and impressive presentation about these fascinating interiors and their treatments, and the motivation for your involvement with so many examples around the world. I would now like to introduce our first student presenter of this session, Tjabbe Nijs. Tjabbe is in their third bachelor year studying conservation restoration at the University of Antwerp. They are currently engaged in the restoration of an early 19th century Augsburg cabinet, and their bachelor thesis research focuses on the polishing techniques employed on ebony imitations used in the 17th and 18th centuries. Their primary interest in the field lies in the conservation of wooden archaeological artifacts, but also it extends to various other materials. Tjabbe will talk about finishing techniques employed on ebony and tortoiseshell imitations in the Netherlands during the 17th and 18th centuries. Please go ahead, Tjabbe.
Hello. Okay. Hello, everyone. Well, my name is Tjabbe, and today I'll discuss the finishing techniques employed on ebony imitations, not tortoiseshell, in the Netherlands during the 17th and 18th century. I'll start with a brief introduction to the topic. Next, I'll discuss the historical sources I've analyzed. Afterwards, I'll discuss the main materials used for polishing. Next, I'll discuss how I created my mock-ups to test these materials. And based on the historical sources, I made a series of tests, which I'll discuss briefly. And I'll end by discussing the preliminary results, since I haven't done all my tests yet. So this study is part of the Belspo Fetwe and Hommage project. My research began by analyzing historical recipes from the Netherlands, France, Germany, and England to identify common techniques used on furniture and other objects. Mock-ups based on these recipes are used to test multiple materials, and the results of these mock-ups are then evaluated by conducting a color and gloss analysis and the mock-ups and comparing them to a 19th century Augsburg cabinet from the Royal Museum for Art and History. Various historical sources were consulted for this research to determine which finishing techniques were described in the 17th and 18th centuries. Since the research is defined regionally in the Netherlands, only sources published in places corresponding to the current Netherlands or Belgium are analyzed. However, sources from Germany, France, and the United Kingdom were also analyzed to allow for a comparison between techniques described. Where no suitable sources have been found in the Dutch sources. For extended periods, sources from other regions were used to supplement them. The oldest source analyzed is Dat Bestandhofke van Recepten from Jan Grosses, published in 1548 in Amsterdam. And other sources include Stalker and Parker, a treatise of japanning and varnishing, published in Oxford. Ribot's L'Art du Menuisier, published in Paris in 1772, and Der Curieuze Kunst und Werkschule, written by Kunkel in 1707 and published in Nuremberg. In total, 38 recipes from 14 different books were analyzed. The analysis of the recipes was focused on finding out which materials and techniques were mentioned. In this graph, you can see the results. I'll discuss the materials in more detail in a moment, but the material that was most commonly mentioned in the recipes is Tripoli, followed by pumice. Next are an unspecified cloth and oil, meaning that the author did not mention which kind to use. A few unique materials that have come out of this analysis are Gotland stone, mentioned by Hendrik and Johannes Kok. Presumably, this refers to some kind of pumice stone from the Gotland island in Sweden. However, I haven't found any other sources to confirm this yet. Another unique find is a polishing technique mentioned by Gommel in 1778. He writes about polishing met de tand, which literally translates to with the tooth. I've also yet to find out what he meant with this. And finally, in a recipe by Ludeman from 1746, he mentions a polishing technique where you should use the bacon rinds and a woolen cloth to improve the gloss of a surface finish. Since this graph is quite complicated, I've made a simpler one that shows the big categories, such as cloth and oil. The results from this graph means that cloth is the most mentioned material. Cloth is often identified as either linen or leather, but also wool and cotton are mentioned quite often. The second biggest category is oil, which is frequently mentioned as boomolie, which freely translates to tree oil and refers to olive oil. But also linseed oil as well as lamp and almond oil have also been mentioned a few times. And this graph will provide the basis for my decisions on which materials to test on the mock-ups. But first, I'll briefly explain the purpose of most common ingredients. So pumice is a porous volcanic rock, mainly composed of potassium, aluminum, silicates, and some trace metals. In historical recipes, it's both mentioned as a rock, for example by Ribot, but more often it's mentioned as a powder. It's often used as the first and most coarse abrasive in the recipes analyzed. On the right is a microscopic image of the pumice I used for the reconstructions of the recipes, but I'll talk about that more in a moment. Tripoli is a fine, lightweight silica sedimentary rock. Its name is derived from the city of Tripoli in Greece, where it was historically abundant. It's a soft powder, devoid of any sharp cutting edges, making it a great polishing agent. Other sources of Tripoli are from the UK, where it's called rotten stone, and Germany, where it's known as kieselguhr. It's often used after using a coarser abrasive and functions as a polishing agent. Next up is tin oxides. It's most often called tin ash in the recipes, and it comes in two varieties. The first one is tin 4 oxide and then tin 2 oxide. And like Tripoli, tin oxide is often used after pumice and is a finer polishing agent. And it's a white powder. Then the final powder that's used is wheat flour. It has a double role in most historical recipes. The first one is again as a fine polishing agent, similar to Tripoli, but even softer. And the second function is to absorb water or oil if they're used in the recipes. For example, Hendrik Koch describes its use after polishing with Tripoli and oil to rub the flour on the surface and remove the greasy flour again. So presumably to remove the greasiness of the oil. And coming to oil and water then, they are used for one as most often in combination with Tripoli or pumice to create some kind of polishing pastes. They can be easily applied to a cloth. And the picture on the left here is a microscopic image of a Tripoli plus olive oil mixture, and on the right, Tripoli plus water. They're quite similar, but the oil mixture makes for a more pasty-like substance. And then there was also one recipe mentioned in the corpus that didn't describe the use of oil with Tripoli or pumice and just used oil in combination with a linen cloth to polish a surface. Okay, next up I will discuss about how I created the mockups and why some decisions were made. Since the focus of the research lies on polishing techniques, I want to incorporate as few variables as possible in the basis of the mockups. This will be reflected in the decisions made during the process. So for the mockups, varnish was needed. The requirements for the varnish were one, that it's safe for use, two, that it's based on a historical recipe, but simple enough so that it can be easily recreated and has very few variables. For this, a varnish recipe from Martin was chosen. The recipe was published in 1772 in Paris, and while this is slightly out of the geographical zone, it's very similar to other recipes found in the sources. So the varnish is made from ethanol, sandrak and turpentine. The sandrak and ethanol were heated and the turpentine was heated separately. When once heated up to around 75 degrees, they were mixed and boiled together to form the varnish, which was then left to rest for 48 hours. So preparation of the mockups. For the mockups, I used a pear root veneer. Historically, many wood species have been used to create ebony imitations, and pear root being one of them. Pear has a fine wood grain and when blackened imitates ebony quite well. For the staining process, a commercial wood stain was used to blacken the pear roots. I decided not to follow a historical recipe for the staining process for two reasons. First, there are so many recipes for staining woods and all have many variables to consider. And secondly, the underlying black color was deemed less important since the focus mainly lies on polishing of the surface finish. So I just applied 6 layers of increasing ratios of the stain to apply it to the veneer. And as a final preparation step, the varnish is applied to the veneer. The amount of varnish layers also varies between recipes. Some mention as many as 10 layers or more, but most often it lies between 1 and 4. So for the mockups, I decided that I wanted to apply 2 layers of varnish, and they were left to dry 24 hours between applications. So the test series I decided to reconstruct are based on the most common keywords found in the recipes, as shown in the graph at the beginning. And they're all permutations of pumice, Tripoli, tin oxide, oil or water, and some form of linen or leather. So I haven't done all my tests at this moment, but I will be discussing the preliminary results of Series 1, 2, and 3. Series 1 is the simplest one, using only pumice on the bottom right, pumice with Tripoli on the bottom left, and pumice with flower on the upper left of that mock-up. And the upper right one is left blank to compare to. The surface finish on these tests were quite rough. Series 2 then uses a combination of Tripoli and water. The left side has been polished using a piece of sheep leather, and the right side using a linen cloth. And on the bottom two squares, flour has also been applied to remove the water afterwards. And similar to Series 2, Series 3 combines Tripoli, but now with olive oil. And same here, the right side has been polished using sheep leather, and the left side is being polished using a linen cloth. Overall, Series 3 resulted in the most matte finish. The series, however, also felt smoothest with no visible surface features. And Series 2 had the most saturated color and had some surface features left. And the polishing paste based on the olive oil worked the best for the polishing. The final steps of my research will be to complete Series 4 and 5, which test tin oxides in comparison to Tripoli. After completing this, a color and gloss analysis will be conducted, and at the same time, a color and gloss analysis will also be conducted on a 19th century cabinet to compare the results. The aim here is to see if we can determine how the cabinet was polished and more generally how the finishes compare. And here's a picture of the cabinets. So in conclusion, I found that many recipes use the same 5 common materials, that being pumice, Tripoli, tin oxides, then water or oil, and some sort of cloth. Preliminary results show that a more matte finish than anticipated, since the surfaces do not have a mirror-like finish as expected. The comparison between the cabinet and the mock-ups has not yet been completed, and the effectiveness of more unique methods still needs to be researched, such as charcoal, different kind of oils, chalk, and cotton or woolen cloths. Thank you for listening, and thanks to all the people who have helped me thus far in my thesis. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tjabbe, for this fascinating collection of recipes and materials, as well as the interesting reconstructions. We all like to do these things. Let's move forward on to our next student presentation. I now have the pleasure to introducing Caro van Mierlo. Caro is currently enrolled in a first year's master student. No, she is enrolled as a first year's master student in conservation restoration at the University of Antwerp. She undertook an internship at a wood restoration company in Belgium spanning a month, during which Caro acquired foundational practical skills. In addition to her prior bachelor thesis, which focused on the flattening of undulated horn veneer, Caro's current academic pursuits entail specialization in the imitation of tortoiseshell. Caro will talk about a treatment report of an 18th century crucifix from the Carolus Borromeus church in Antwerp. Caro, over to you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'll try and share my camera. So today I will be discussing a restorative journey of the 18th century altarpiece that you can see right here. I will start with a small context around the object, continuing with the damage report of the object. We also did some additional XRF analysis, which will be discussed in the presentation. And last but not least, I will give a brief introduction into the treatment that was conducted. So the object you can see here is, for reference, about 1 meter and 20 centimeters high, so it's quite big. And it's coming from the Carolus Borromeus church in Antwerp, which is, in my opinion, the most beautiful Baroque church I've ever seen. but maybe I'm biased, I don't know. The object is composed of 3 parts. I'll indicate them. So the first one is the crucifix itself. Then we have the first smaller basement and a second larger basement. The datings of the 3 separate parts are also different. We suspect that the bottom part is the oldest, stemming from the 17th century, followed by the upper crucifix coming from the 18th century. And then we suspect that the last addition was this middle part that was a 19th century addition. Or at least a rearrangement of the original, because there was mahogany veneer on the sides, and mahogany veneer is typical material that is used in the 19th century. We also found an inscription in the inside of this part. It said the year 1844. And then there was a text written inside of it as well, and that said repaired and improved by a certain restorator. We could not identify its name because it was very unclearly written, but we know for sure that at least the middle part was restored somewhere in the 19th century. So then about the iconography. The upper part symbolizes the Calvary Mountain, where Mary and Nicomedes the crucifix Jesus. And then on the gravure on the front, we see the Lamentation of Christ, where 3 female figures are crying above the dead body of Jesus Christ. For the materials that were used, we can see mostly ebony wood, veneer, and a turtle shell. But you can also see some silver sculptures and ornaments, as well as a brass gilded gravure. So this is an overview of all the materials that are present. So in this image, we can see the silver and the brass. Here we can see where all the ebony is present, and lastly we see where the turtle shell is located. Then over to the damage report. The main issue that we saw on this object was the loss of many materials. There were many lacunas in the tortoise shell, as well as lacunas or missing parts in the wooden moldings. Both straight moldings and curved moldings were lost, and these moldings are here, 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 and they were all gone, completely missing. What we also saw is what we see here is biological colonization. So the woodworm was present in this object, which led to an anoxy treatment at the end of the treatment to make sure that all the pests that might be still present could be eliminated. What we also saw was a discolored varnish on the silver statues that was present, but also some forming of corrosion on the gilded brass. To improve our background research, we performed some XRF, portable XRF analysis to prove or not prove our hypotheses. The XRF on the tortoise shell stated that there was a large peak of not vermilion, but mercury present, and the presence of mercury can be linked to the pigment of vermilion. This is a red pigment that was used frequently in history, and this was something that we suspected to be present, and that was confirmed by using XRF analysis. We also performed it on the silver sculptures, and here we can see a large peak at the energy level of silver, which also proved our hypotheses that it was indeed silver. And last but not least, we did the same on the gravure. We see a large peak in the region of copper and zinc, so we could conclude that it was brass and not some other metal alloy. So this was very useful to use in the treatment. So then we could start with the treatment of the object itself. We did an overall cleaning, mechanical cleaning of the whole object. So we used a synthetic brush as well as a vacuum cleaner to remove all the dust. And then we specified the treatment further per material. For example, we can see the cleaning of the silver here. As I said before, the varnish that was present was very discolored. In this image, you can see that the varnish has a very yellowy undertone. So we performed some tests on it with different solvents like acetone, ethanol, white spirit, and shell salt to see which one was most efficient to remove the varnish, and we concluded that that was acetone. We started, of course, by using cotton wipes, but this was not efficient. It took very, very long. We also used compresses, but still that wasn't very efficient. So in the end, we used an acetone bath where we soaked the sculptures in for a couple of hours, which was very scary because I never did that. But it's not harmful at all to the silver itself, so it's perfectly fine to do that. And then in the image here, you can see the result after the cleaning, which was very improving indeed. After that, we decided to also polish the sculptures, but we decided to keep it very low-key and to be very held back in it. We also polished only the upper parts of the sculpture, so the deeper laid parts, we stayed out of it. They were very darkened over time. And in contrast with the high parts that were indeed polished, you create a very high contrast between light and dark, which allows us to read the sculptures actually even better. So we create a contrast in it. And we also prevent for the calcium carbonate paste to stay behind in this deeper laid parts, which can be very damaging to the future. And lastly, we made some structural support to the tears that were present on the base of the statues. Because of stress that stood onto the sculptures, there were tears on the lower parts of these sculptures, and we supported them with glass fiber, which we glued onto the tears with paralloid B60 to make sure that they could not tear any further. Moving on, we cleaned the brass. As I said before, there was some corrosion, which you can see here. The corrosion was induced by candle wax, which is consisting of paraffin, and that is very acidic. And this acid caused the brass to locally corrode, as you can see here. It's also green, and that is typical for copper corrosion. So this was our first indication to make assumptions that the gravure could be containing copper, which led us to suspecting that the gravure was made out of brass. So first of all, we did a mechanical cleaning with a vacuum cleaner, but also we used a wooden stick to scrape off the excess wax that was still present. And after that, we removed all the corrosion that was still present with shell salt D80 to make sure that all the paraffin rests were removed and could not corrode again. So on the image here, you can really see how the corrosion is totally removed, and it did in fact not damage the gilded brass underneath. Furthermore, we restored the original wax layer that was present. This wax layer was mostly present on the base of the object, so the lowest basement. Because of wear and tear, the wax layer was very blotched. It was very damaged. You can see in the image here that it is not reflecting the light as it should be. We tried to thin out this wax layer by using white spirit and shell salt, both apolar solvents that normally would dissolve the wax that is also apolar. but we suspected that because of aging, the consistency of this wax changed, causing it to not be able to dissolve in white spirit and shell anymore. So this was not an efficient way of removing the wax layers, which led us to use an ultrafine steel wool. You might be thinking that it was very harmful, but it really is not. We used such a fine steel wool that we didn't actually scratch the surface, but more so polished it to even out this old wax layer rather than removing it by polishing it or sanding it away. So we polished it, and after that we applied a thin layer of new wax. We used Cosmoloid H80, and afterwards you can see that the layer still has its original patina, and its the scratches are still visible, but you can see that the light, because of this new wax layer, is reflecting more evenly, causing it to look more aesthetically pleasing. We also did some infills, mostly on the missing parts in the moldings. With the example of the straight moldings, we actually made our own knife, which you can see here, made out of steel, where we used files and tools to exactly replicate the profile of the moldings you can see here. We, after that, put it inside of a specific historical machine. Actually, in Dutch it's called a trekbank. I don't know the translation to English, but you fixate the knife in the machine, and you place the wood that you want to carve underneath it, and when you turn a wheel on the side of the machine, this wooden block actually moves back and forth under the knife, which causes the knife to scrape away the wood and exactly imitating the profile onto the wood itself. So after the carving, we cut it to size, and we sawed it in the right angle. Then we made some tests on how to color the wood properly. We used pear wood because the grain of this wood is quite similar to the grain of ebony. And while using colorants and bites, we were able to really imitate the color of ebony, as you can see here after coloring. And in that way, we could glue the pieces onto the front, and they were not visible anymore. We also had to replicate these curved moldings. This was quite difficult to do since every piece was unique, and they were not quite similar. So the carving in this case would not work because each piece was very different. So what we did was that we used silicone moldings, actually the same silicone as the dentists use when you go for braces. They put it in your mouth. It's very it's not nice, but we used it here also on the intact part of the curved moldings on the other sides. So we could create a mold, and we filled that mold with a kneadable epoxy called milliput, and this hardens very fast. You can also get it in different colors, so we used the black, and as you can see, it's almost perfect color match. And in that way, we were able to exactly replicate the molding onto the missing part. So that was a very efficient way of working. Then we also filled in the missing tortoiseshell. As you can see here, we could not use turtle shell as well because it is a protected species, so we used horn of cows instead. We started out with thinning and flattening the horn that we ordered. We used clamps and moisture for this. Afterwards, we thinned the horn out by using a sandner, but also using a sanding paper. We polished also the horn to give it the same reflecting effect as the turtle shell. We used ethanol and kaolin powder for this, and as you can see here, the light is very reflecting. It's almost like a mirror. And then we tried to imitate the blotches that are so typical for turtle shell, and we used hair dye for this. This was a tip that I got from Uli Fryer, a Swiss restorer of Borromeus, and he told me that hair dye was very efficient to use because horn is also, as your hair, made out of keratin, so it's very illogical, but I would never think of it. And it was very easy. You just lay out the hair dye on the place where you want it to be. You leave it for a couple hours and then you just wipe it off. And depending on the color you use, the thickness of the layer, and how long you let it on, you can create really this deepness and depth that is also present in real turtle shell. And when you afterwards add a vermilion background, you really see that the sample that I made here imitates the turtle shell quite well. And as I said before, there was an inscription you can see here present in the smallest basement of the object. I was so free to put in a paper with my own name inside of the basement to leave a trace of the restoration I did, just as the restorer before me did. And because of the presence of the historic inscription, we decided not to glue the panel back together. Because there was a large tear in it that spread out all over the object, which caused us to be able to take out the panel and look inside of the basement. So instead of just gluing or hammering it back and close it forever, we decided to integrate a magnet system. As you can see here, we glued in a wooden block with a tiny magnet inside of it. We did the same onto the panel that we could take out. And then when you click it in, it is closed quite firmly because of the magnet's power, but you are also able to manipulate it in a way that the magnets disconnect and the panel can be taken out. So that was something that I find very interesting to do. And that was the last part, and here here you can see before and after. Here you can see the missing part in the turtle shell, and here you can see how the hair dye usage is actually quite efficient to mark it up. And that was kind of my presentation. So if you have further questions, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Caro, for sharing your insights into the examination and treatment of this fine object with a challenging combination of materials and conservation problems. We now have a 15-minute question and answer sessions. I see some questions popped up in the chat box. Let's start with our keynote speaker. Anke, Tjabbe, and Caro, could you please unmute your microphone when we ask you to? So, Anke, could you please unmute your microphone now?
Yes, I did.
Perfect, thank you. The first question comes from Andreas Krupa. Anke, thank you very much. Did I get it right? Are there normally no varnishes on the surfaces of these colorful rooms? At first glance, some of the photos impressions seem to present an idea of lacquerware, but this has not been intentional. No gloss, ? So the question is if they were varnished originally or not.
No, they were not varnished. The painting materials used are like matte and glossy ones. So if you would put in varnish, you would destroy this effect. This is what happened later when they applied the varnish on everything. And what was striking to see also it's actually only 3 rooms that I found in 20 years that were never treated in Damascus. And there the tinfoil as well as the copper alloy is perfectly preserved. They obviously start their corrosion when they are covered with varnishes that contain resin, which has acidic elements. So that's why, they were not supposed to have a varnish, and any varnish or any protection layer that I came across in 25 years was harmful. And even they get tension later. So my experience is no protection layer, it's just damaging layer. And even, you know, if you want to get it out later again, if you want to remove it, you have glazes that have resin components. So even the yellow and the orange yellow glazes, the original ones on tinfoil, are super sensitive often. Like, for example, in the room at the Metropolitan Museum, the yellow was super sensitive. So anything you apply later, you would never be able to remove it later. So that's another, how to say, another reason why I would just really say no to any varnish. And it doesn't even need a protection layer. You know, I've seen rooms, they were there 250 years without a protection layer, and they are perfectly preserved. They are made, you know, to be used and live until conservators come across, or like people who try to maintain them. Being polite.
Okay, thank you. The second question comes from Wermut Kreb. Thank you, Anke. Great objects. Can you maybe elaborate a bit about the material aspects? What are the binding media? For instance, in the gesso, what is the brown varnish, and what did you use to remove the brown varnish?
Yeah, the gesso is animal glue. That's what we found in all the analyses so far. And the paint layers, how to say, they vary. You have tempera, which is a mixture of like oil and resin and protein binding media. Then you have the small, that's actually bound in obviously egg white and animal glue, like a mixture. And then you have the glazes, or like thin layers, thin outlines that have like a high amount of resin as a binding media. So you always have like a wide variety of binding media in one object. So you really need to know which paint layer has which binding media to know with which solvent or liquid you can work on it.
And what about the varnishes?
Yeah. The objects where we have analyzes, it's often pine resin or colophon. So, and what they use today in Syria, it's shellac, a mixture sometimes with pine. And in two rooms we found sandarak as well. So, and yeah, they all have their like acidic condition. So what I could see actually in cross sections, that the corrosion starts from the top. If you look at the cross section, so it's obvious that the corrosion starts from the varnish layers.
Yeah. And the final part of the question was regarding the varnishes. What did you use to remove the brown varnish? Well, it depends, yeah, obviously, but
it depends. Yeah, it depends. In most, on most surface paint layers, either acetone works because it's pretty fast. So you have it like a very short moment on the surface. You can remove the varnish. And also the glazes often are stable enough, like the copper resinate, it's pretty stable. The red is usually pretty stable. And in some rooms, we used also methyl ethyl ketone, because the acetone just didn't work for this specific varnish. So that, I mean, and sometimes making a compress on certain areas helps, you know, where we know it's stable and there's no resin in the binding media. So usually it's a mixture of, you know, working on large surfaces. Some areas are sensitive. You can go only just like 2 seconds on it, and others you can leave it like 2 minutes. So it really needs a lot of experience and a deep understanding of the materials used. So it looked like easy on my images, but it's a lot of scientific research behind it, I have to admit.
Thank you. Yeah, the next question comes from me, actually. I was wondering regarding the scale, the size of the objects. I mean, how long does a conservation take if funding is existing? I mean, if funding. So if you start, if the money is there once you start, and so can you name it? How many hours or how many?
Yes, of course.
years?
Yeah, of course. On one hand, it's also related to what the owners want to achieve. So in Qatar, for example, where everything is like blinky, we were kind of afraid that the museum or like the people who, how to say, have their expectations were not happy enough in a way, because they're not really used to see like aged surfaces. So, but how to say, that's why I suggested to go for like a first step, like doing like 70-80% of the work progress that I would feel comfortable with, and then always discuss it every like 2-3 months with the entire team to keep them all on board, that they understand what's possible, technically possible and aesthetically possible, and where are limits, and yeah, you know, try to keep them all on board. That's one of my experiences that are very important to always being on the, how to say, on the same page. So, and yeah, then it depends how quickly the varnish can be removed. In Berlin, I'm pretty lucky. But even then, on each panel, how to say, you have like 20 square centimeters where it's pretty fast, and then you go to the next 20 centimeters and almost nothing is happening. So that's an issue as well. And I mean, in Berlin now, it was 3 years, just me, more or less, for the entire room, which is 10 walls, 3.5 meters by 3 meters, which is quite a lot. And in Doha, for example, it was 1.5 years with like a team of 4, including myself. And in Dresden, consolidation was a big part. I would say it was like 2 years consolidation with a team of 3, 400 square meters. It really depends. So, and in Dresden, actually, we had to do it in portions because we also needed to explain and to convince potential donors, look, this is what would be the outcome. This is what's possible. Are you happy to support us? So this is what we actually did step by step.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that are really huge projects, yes, and I think it can be hard to calculate, yes, but it's
yeah, it really depends. And what I usually
1 year to 3.
Yeah. What I usually do is asking for a period of like 2 or 3 weeks to have me come to do like tests and, you know, getting in feeling where's the tricky parts. And usually, of course, I need to start with a, how to say, worse or like the areas that are in bad condition, just to see what's still possible. And then to get an idea of how much time and how much money it would cost. And then it also depended how to say, who would be my team. Because in Los Angeles, for example, they told me I shall just come and they would provide me the team to work with. And in Doha, they said, just bring everything, including manpower. There's nothing on site. So it really depends.
Yes. Okay, thank you. And the final question comes from Francesca Muscat. She would like to know, what was the other name for the pastilla?
Yeah, it's Ajami in Arabic, and it actually means Persian in the Arabic language or non-Arabic. So I thought long time, being a conservator, that this refers to the technique that might have their origin in Iran, but it actually refers only to the pattern. So they call the pattern that are made with these raised gesso ornaments Persian design-wise, because the depicted or like the painted motifs are actually Persian textiles. So, and they call the, how to say, they call the technique ajami, as well as the motifs that are achieved with it, as well as the entire interiors. So everything is ajami there.
Makes it sometimes easier, maybe.
Yeah,
okay.
depending what you're talking about.
Thank you, Anke. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
There are also some questions for Tjabbe. Could you unmute your microphone, please?
Yes.
Okay. So the first question comes from Andreas. Tjabbe, thank you very much. The simple varnish of Vatin contains turpentine. There are several turpentines on the market today. What turpentine did you use? That's an interesting question.
That's indeed a good question because I'm not quite sure. I probably have it written down somewhere. I can look it up, but I don't have the answer directly.
Yeah, maybe you can look it up later and put it in the chat if you find it. But no worry, no worry. The second question comes from Sophie. She says, interesting subject. In the historical sources, were the polishing techniques also used in combination with the varnish? And did you polish your samples before or after applying the varnish?
Most recipes do include a varnish indeed. It's mainly before like 1650 that the recipes do not mention a varnish, so it's just like wood that's stained black and then polished. And then after like 1650, most recipes do mention some sort of varnish, yeah. And then for the polishing, I didn't polish the veneer on beforehand, but we did like sand it down with a P600 sanding paper. So.
Okay, before you applied the varnish.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay, thank you. And there's a remark from Shane. She says, polishing with a tooth might be borrowed from gilding, where dog teeth were used for burnishing, I think. Agate more common today. That was kind of
burnishing tools I did come across, so I've written it down. I'm going to look into it.
Yeah. And the next question comes from Bernard Krepp. How can you later in the research on the objects distinguish between the blackening, staining, and the polishing materials? She would like to know.
So I'm going to do a color analysis to determine the effects basically of the blackening. And I've also kept some mock-ups that are not stained. So after doing all my tests, I can like repolish those to see if there's any effects with or without the staining.
Okay, thank you. And the final question comes from Sophie. Was there a change in materials used over time, or did they stay much the same? Was there a difference in some materials from country to country? And given that many materials that you mentioned vary on the abrasiveness, were any used in sequences rather than separately? Oh, that's a lot. So maybe we start at the beginning. Was there a difference in what the beginning was a change in materials used over time, or did they stay much the same?
Yeah, so they mostly stay the same, but it does seem like that the thin ash has been a later introduction. So it's way more common at the end of the 18th century in the recipes than say like at the beginning of the 17th century. But yeah, mostly they are the same.
Okay, and it seems like they differ from country to country a little bit, because you said
no, not really.
Okay, not really. Okay, and given that many materials that you mentioned vary in abrasiveness, were any used in sequences rather than separately?
Yeah, so most recipes start with a rougher abrasive, so like pumice stone, and then they move on to tripoli with an oil, and then like in the ends often there's a mention of flour or like some sort of chalk or something. So yeah. It's
Okay,
it's
thank
often
you.
a sequence.
Okay, thank you. And I have to correct myself. The question wasn't from Sophie. It was from Shane.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So thank you, Tjabbe. There are also some questions for Caro. The first question comes from Sophie. Hi, I missed it, or maybe I missed it, but why did you use Cosmoloid as a finish before for the previously waxed parts?
We used Cosmoloid since it's a synthetic wax, so this means that it has very preferable aging characteristics. So it will not yellow, it will not cross-link, but it will also not oxidate. So that is very useful to know. And it also allowed us to use the solvents that we wanted. So we used shell salt, for example, since it's a lesser toxic solvent than, for example, white spirit that you can find in the Renaissance wax that is more commercially spread. So these are the two factors that we used to choose Cosmoloid as the material to use, actually.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So the dyeing process of the horn is of particular interest. So there are a number of questions. Do you know, from Shane and Anke, question is, do you know how light fast the hair dye is?
No, we actually don't know for sure. We do know that it is quite, how do I say it? It's quite harsh a method since we use hydrogen peroxide, so it really catches on in the keratin, and it also sort of I'm looking for the right words. It's quite harmful for the material. It really bleaches the material, and with combination of the pigments present in the hair dye, we really colored the keratin in the mess, so not superficial, but it really soaked into the material. But we do not know for sure how light fast it is, so we used a finishing layer on top, Tinivin, and Tinivin has some UV protecting characteristics, so in that way we could ensure that the light fastness was more sure and more stable, in fact.
Good, thanks. You have already answered in detail the next question. So that was about the method of dyeing that you have used. So I think I just move on to the following question. That's from Wilmut. Thank you. Would it be necessary to protect the silver after cleaning and polishing?
We thought about that a great deal, but we decided not to do that, because when you want to apply a new varnish or a new protective layer, you have to make sure that you spread it very evenly, very uniform, and every change in thickness of that protecting layer can cause the silver to corrode underneath in a different way. So when you are not sure that you applied the coat evenly, this can result in an unevenly corrosion. And since the sculptures were so full of highs and lows and the surface was not even at all, it would be very difficult to ensure that the protecting layer would be even everywhere. And in conversation with a metal restorer, we also concluded that the corrosion right now is very stable and would present itself more evenly throughout the years without protective layer than with protective layer. So on long term, it would be better for the sculptures to be unprotected, actually.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question is from Anton. He would like to know if there was a specific reason why you choose horn to imitate the tortoiseshell and not a synthetic material.
I have to confess that we actually did not even think about using a synthetic material, because there was so many research done on bullenmarqueterie where lacunas were filled with horn, and it appeared to be a very positively and easily to use material. So it is hygroscopic and thermoplastic. So with use of water and warmth, you can really shape it in a way you want. So it's quite easy to work with. It is also very durable. There is no plastic waste that originates with the manufacturing of the material, as is as is present when using more synthetic materials. So because of its many uses in polymer tree conservation, we decided to just go with horn actually.
Good, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Anke, Tjabbe, and Caro, and thank you, the audience, for the interesting questions. And we will collect the remaining ones and forward them to our speakers so that they can have a look later, or that we post them in the chat as well. Abstracts of all presentations can be found in the ConNext book of abstracts. The link in the chat will point you straight to it. And just before we start our break, we have been asked to promote an event that's being organized by some of the students of Westin called Conservation Connection Forum, Building Supportive Communities Through Advocacy. You can download the PDF with more information by clicking on the download icon at the bottom right of the black part of your screen. And for more information, you can contact Melina, whose email address will be shared in the chat right now, I think. So now we'll have a 10-minute break. So get yourself a cup of tea or a beer or some cookies or chips, and see you back in 10 minutes at 20:33.
Yes, should. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good little break and are ready to continue. First off, after the break is Katherine Peters. Katherine, also known as Kiki Peters, is a second-year graduate student in the Winterthur University of Delaware program in Art Conservation Study and Objects Conservation. During the summer of 2023, she completed a graduate conservation internship at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Previously, she completed her pre-program internship at the Yale University Art Gallery. In 2020, she graduated with distinction from Yale University with a BA in the history of art. Katherine will present to us about her Searching for Saints, a technical study of a German polychrome altar. Katherine, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to you all for viewing in today. The title of this presentation is Searching for Saints, a technical study on a German polychrome altar. As advertised, my presentation will focus on the study of this work. But before that, I will provide an overview of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Then I will talk about my technical study on the altar. As part of my graduate requirement, I spent 8 weeks as an intern at the Gardner Museum last summer. My supervisor was Jessica Kloros, Objects Conservator. The Director of Conservation is Holly Salmon. There's a conservation team that maintains the artworks both inside and including the museum. I say including the museum because the building is a giant work of installation art itself. Isabella Stewart Gardner is not only the namesake of the institution, but also the person who founded, collected, and curated the museum. She had some help from friends like Bernard Berenson, a notable American art historian. At first, these artworks were kept in her home on Beacon Street. You can see in this photograph that the house was brimming with artworks, which she wanted to one day share. In 1903, she opened the museum. It encompasses a series of stage rooms around this courtyard that integrates Roman, Byzantine, Romanesque, Gothic, and Renaissance elements. Gardner died in July of 1924 and left the museum to her trust. In her will, she stipulated that the museum stay exactly as she left it. So these rooms, which make up only a portion of the museum's collection, have stayed the same since Isabella made them to when I worked there last summer. Isabella wanted the museum to be for the education and enjoyment of the public forever. And I've highlighted forever because us in conservation know that forever is a very long time. A notable thing about the museum is that its conservation department was founded in the 1930s, which makes it one of the oldest conservation labs in America. Its first conservator was George Stout, who's known as some by the father of conservation in the US. He became the museum director in 1955. So from the very beginning, the Gardner was committed to the preservation of its collections. This means their artworks have conservation histories, and luckily they have good records too. That will become relevant later in this presentation. Now I will begin the discussion of my technical study by giving you a history of this altar titled St. Maurice and the Theban Legion. The wooden polychrome relief sculpture is about 5 feet or 1.5 meters tall. It depicts the scene of a saint who is holding a flag, riding a horse, and surrounded by 16 individuals. According to a carved inscription on the bottom decorative border, the sculpture dates to 1515. It's believed to either be German or Swiss and part of an unknown altarpiece. In 1892, Isabella purchased this altarpiece from an exporter in Paris. At the time, it was described as depicting Joan of Arc. It went to her home in Boston in 1893. Then it was installed in the Gothic room on the wall above the mantel of the fireplace. It hangs directly across from Isabella's portrait. Per the stipulation in her will, it's remained there ever since, with the exception of 2 visits to the conservation lab, once in 1950 and the other last summer. You might be wondering why I titled my presentation Searching for Saints when this altar depicts St. Maurice. Well, it does and it doesn't. The characterization of the saint's identity has changed during the object's lifetime. From Joan of Arc to St. George to St. Geryon, and then to St. Maurice. The institution has archival records that unpack these changes, but those are largely the result of art historical speculation. And this is where my technical study comes in. In 2023, Adrian Chaparro, curatorial assistant, reopened the discussion of I'm
Kiki,
gonna
you lost.
start
Yeah,
over from this slide, so that way hopefully the connection
yeah.
stays good. So
Okay,
in
thank you, Kiki.
2023, Adrian Chaparro, curatorial assistant, reopened the discussion of the saint's identity and race because recent scholarship notes that at this time in Germany, Saint Maurice was sometimes depicted as African with a dark complexion. For this reason, the sculpture was brought into the conservation lab to explore this topic through technical investigation. As it was the first time the object was off display since 1950, basic art historical and technical information was reported. The goal of the study was to gain a better understanding of the object and identification of the saint. The first step in this process was to write a condition report on the sculpture, which focused on describing its method of fabrication and previous restoration. Then ultraviolet imaging, infrared imaging, borescope photography, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, cross-section analysis, wood analysis, and X-radiography were performed to help determine and describe the materials present. I'll walk through a summary of my findings, but first I'm going to describe the artwork. The saint is represented with a white flesh tone and wearing armor decorated with gold and silver gilding. He's holding a flag that bears a painted white cross on a red background, and the flag is carved to depict it flowing in the wind. There are three other figures in the foreground. The proper leftmost is in gilded armor and wearing a textured hat. He's armed
Kiki, I think your connection is interrupted again.
The form of his grip indicates he likely held an element like a spear, which was lost at some point during the object's lifetime. To his proper right is a man with a mustache. He's wearing a hat and a green dress with armor under it. The remaining 13 individuals are all unique. The sculpture is composed of a panel, an engaged frame, a decorative bottom border, and multiple figures carved in high relief. They are held together by ferrous metal nails. Based on evidence such as form, position of nails, and holes in the engaged frame, possibly from metal hardware, the object likely originated as part of a larger architectural structure, like an altarpiece. Based on the direction of the bodies, this is the intended viewing angle of the relief within the larger altar. As you can see, the recto of the sculpture is completely covered in polychrome surface layers. The artwork has a white background, gilded layers, and paint, which is likely oil-based. The sculpture is in good and stable condition for its age. The wood panel is warped and there are multiple structural losses, like a missing hand on the proper rightmost figure. In the surface layers, there are minor losses and some flaking. The sculpture was heavily restored in the 1950s. While this treatment stabilized the artwork and compensated for many historical losses, it also affected the original paint layers by adding new conservation materials and extensive overpaint onto the artwork. Something I love about polychrome sculptures is that they had a life that required the works to be maintained. Often, these sculptures were cleaned, scrubbed down, and repainted. For this reason, their surfaces are complex and have many levels of past interventions present. This summer, I wanted to gain experience in differentiating between historical surfaces and conservation layers. This is where the gardener's conservation records come in handy. The overpaint dates to a treatment from the 1950s. In 1950, Alfred Jaxtus, a conservator at the Gardner, carried out and documented a restoration on this work. I've included his before treatment image on the slide now. In summary, he consolidated the work with wax, removed grime, filled the losses and cracks with wax and pigment, coated the back of the sculpture with wax, coated the entire surface with a PVA varnish, and then overpainted. The overpaint was extreme. Here's a close-up of the saint's face before that treatment and now. Also, some structural work is evident but not noted in Jaxtus' report. That includes a crossbar along the bottom and these wooden inserts. We were hoping that imaging would give us insight to the surface layers, which could then help us identify the saint. Ultraviolet imaging made some things apparent. Materials across the surface had variable colors of fluorescence. This
Kiki, can you hear me? Maybe it's better to turn off your video to save bandwidth.
This variation was useful in distinguishing areas of restoration in historical paint. As seen in this image of the saint's face, the restoration paints fluoresce darker than the historical paints, which fluoresce a bright white, likely indicating the presence of lead white. The red in the proper leftmost figure's headpiece fluoresces orange, which indicates the presence of a lake pigment. As seen in the right image of the horse's belly, there's an inconsistent varnish layer across the surface. It fluoresces green, indicating it's likely a natural resin varnish. We did not get much information from the infrared image. The surface paint layers contain a large amount of heavy metal pigments, which appear opaque with this technique. For this reason, any surface layer below the current top one was not visible. It's notable that the IR image of the unusual surface. While no distinct underlayer is made out, it's likely that a different design is under the current banner. This was curious to us because Can you all hear me now?
Kiki, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Could you please turn off your video? That might save some bandwidth and make it run more smoothly.
Okay, great. I'm going to restart
Yes.
this slide and just I've been trying to keep an eye on the internet connection.
Yeah, thank you for adapting. No, it's okay. You're doing great. Please continue.
Thank you. It is notable that the IR image in the flag has an unusual surface. While no distinct underlayer is made out, it's likely that a different design is under the current banner. This was curious to us because a flag could contain information on the identity of the saint. Really, we just had general questions about the flag and the saint. Luckily, Adrian set up an art historical consultation with Dr. Jacqueline Jung from Yale University's History of Art department. This meeting came in perfect timing. She noted that Maurice is usually depicted as more stereotypically masculine than the saint, but the current Hospitalis flag does not correspond to Joan of Arc. Professor Jung also noted that the horizontal form of the flag was unusual for 1515, so it might be unoriginal. It also covers up some of the faces in the mountains. For this reason, I took a borescope to check out what was behind it. The form was interesting with this panel-like insert. I made note of it in my report for future experts to explore if they wanted to. Later, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy was carried out to gain information on the materials and to inform sampling areas for cross-section analysis. Analysis was performed using a Bruker tracer spectrometer. Jess and I worked together to collect the data. Then, after a lesson from Jess, I interpreted the data using an RTAC software. We analyzed 50 locations. My plan was to get a better understanding of the color palette of the work. I was also interested in seeing if the gold was gold and the gray in the armor was tarnished silver leaf. Our results were encouraging. The panel and armor are decorated with surfaces that had high peaks of predominantly calcium, iron, and either gold or silver and sulfur. These peaks correlate to gold or silver leaf over a bull layer on a calcium carbonate ground. Indications of silver were also present in 3 of the 5 areas tested on the flag. This surprised us. It pointed to selective placement of silver below the present painted surface layer. And this was really exciting because it meant that a lot of precious metal was used to make the work. Given its large scale, the altar must have been important to some group of people at some point in time. And hopefully this fact will one day help track the original location of the altar down. The main elements present in the work are lead, mercury, calcium, and copper. Based on the results, this is likely the historical color palette. The restoration media appears to be rich in zinc, which was not used until the 18th century. XRF provides elemental information on all of the surface layers. It gave clarity on big picture questions like those regarding metal leaf and restoration material. However, the technique does not answer specific questions about paint stratification. This brings us to cross-section analysis, which provides information on all of the paint layers as well as more precise elemental information about each layer. Sampling areas were identified, justified, and approved by the curator. 20 cross-sections were removed from the relief using a scalpel. Each of these areas were documented with before and after photo documentation. The samples were mounted in X-Tech polyester clear resin and then polished. The cross-sections were examined and photographed using an upright Zeiss microscope and its accompanying software. This microscopy was completed using both visible and ultraviolet light. Then the cross-sections were analyzed using a scanning electron microscope. I went for a short walk down the street to the Museum of Fine Arts Boston Scientific Research Laboratory for this analysis. I worked with Richard Newman, head of scientific research, to perform scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. The SEM gives high magnification and resolution images of the sample, and the EDX allows us to take elemental spectra from a specific location within it. Here are 17 of the 20 cross-sections. For each cross-section, I completed optical microscopy and scanning electron microscopy. Due to time, Richard and I were selective on which ones we chose to complete elemental analysis on, and I'll walk you through what my analysis looked like for samples from the flag and the saints' flesh tones specifically. So to reiterate, we wanted to know if silver was actually in a lower surface layer of the flag, because flags can hold key information about the saint's identity. So if silver was found, we would request the artwork to be transported to the MFA Boston to be X-radiographed. So 2 cross-sections were taken from the flag. Both samples did show evidence of another surface layer under the current design. In the first sample, the bottommost surface layer was covered with silver gilding, which was confirmed with elemental analysis from the EDX. On top of the gilding was a layer with mercury pigments, likely vermilion, and lead-based pigments, likely red lead. These are historical paint layers. The second cross-section is similar to the first, which you can see in the areas indicated by the red arrow. However, there are 2 upper layers of paint with fine particles indicated with the yellow arrow that have peaks in cadmium and mercury. They are likely modern paints, which were applied during the 1950s restoration. Here's an up-close image showing the paint layers on a larger scale. So now that we knew that the flag had multiple surface layers, this information was used to bring the artwork, used to justify bringing the artwork over to the MFA for an X-radiograph. For the saint's flesh tone, 2 layers of paint exist within the sample. The lowest paint layer C is historical paint composed of lead with some irregularly sized mercury particles, likely vermilion, and the upper paint layer E is restoration paint and composed of lead and zinc with some small mercury particles, also likely vermilion. Tying back to the original purpose of this technical study, all the layers contain materials that produce a light flesh tone, so we do not see evidence of an African depiction of Maurice on this object. Results for the wood analysis are that the relief is poplar and the panel is fir. Also, here's the X-radiograph. It's waiting to be fully interpreted, which is very exciting. My work on the project ended here, though we were unable to identify the saint. We still gained a lot of valuable information on this work to add to the object file. So while we are still searching for the saint, we are now a little bit closer. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine, for sharing this fascinating search for saints, and we look forward to the day the mystery is solved. Our last speaker is Anna-Lena Korsten. Anna-Lena is a student of conservation and restoration at the Cologne Institute of Conservation Science, specializing in wooden objects and modern materials. She is currently in her 5th semester and dedicated to understanding the complexities of conserving and restoring objects made from wood. An internship at the Ruhrmuseum Essen has particularly sparked Anna-Lena's interest in ethnological objects. So far, her studies have prepared her with a deep understanding of the ethical consideration involved in conservation practices. Today, she will talk about the ethical discussion on the conservation approach to the coat of arms panel of the guilds. Anna-Lena, the screen is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. I will be presenting to you the ethical discussion of the conservation approach to the coat of arms panel of the Wine Growers Guild. First, I would like to present the panel and its history to you, so you get a little insight about the object itself. After that, I will go into the discussion about the conservation and restoration, and I will describe the questions that arose during the solution finding process. Here you can see what the panel looked like when it first arrived. You can see many different colors and illustrations. That's what I saw at first. It was really, there's a lot to see. There are numerous master marks, craft symbols, and figures and saints depicted here. The images are arranged in 4 equally sized rings oriented towards the center on the reddish-brown background. In total, the panel features 77 different illustrations, each placed on a shield-shaped area. Additionally, there are 13 other shield-shaped areas in the outer ring without illustrations. Moreover, it should be noted that apart from the dates above them, the illustrations do not appear to be ordered, but rather randomly placed on the panel. The various illustrations indicate that there are diverse ways for an individual to immortalize himself on the guild's panel. It remains unclear what criteria individual illustrations were selected and positioned by. Furthermore, in the outer ring, within an exposed area, 4 shield-shaped shields can be found displaying kind of different colorfulness and a very unique and different style when compared to the other images. This gives us a first hint about the rich history of the panel that was later further discovered. Another clue about the origin story was found in the blank spaces here. Many coat of arms panels on many coat of arms panels, these blank spaces can be found. These suggest that the panels were already equipped with waiting shields and fields for inscriptions at a time of their creation, at a later time in subsequent years. Regarding the use and the function, only speculations could be made because there's very little research regarding these panels. They could have served as a list of members or officers used in the everyday internal administration operations of the guild, or even as kind of a memorial tablet for deceased guild members. Additionally, the panel could have just functioned as a decorative element for the guild's room, presenting the long tradition and serving as a symbol for the group. The circular shape and arrangement of the rings, often accompanied by the central pivot point you can see here, implies that the panel could be rotated. However, the context surrounding this aspect remains unclear. On the back of the panel, there could also be seen like circular marks on the edges where there was indication that it was turned at one point, but there's no evidence or any clues of why it was turned. This area, I think I'm on the wrong slide. 1 second. No, okay. That's just one missing. This area I showed you earlier with the 4 exposed areas sparked the initial question about the working history of the panel. There you can see that a layer that's underneath the current one. You could clearly feel it with your fingers or when you're looking through a microscope. And with IR imaging, it was made even more evident. Here you can see under the empty spaces you saw in the outer ring, there was a whole different paint layer beneath the one where you could see all the images. Due to all the different paint layers, many areas exhibit different attributes when being visually examined. By examining these areas further, there were even more changes evident that were made on the panel over the years. And after much work and examining many different areas, we were able to work up a history of all the paint layers, which you can see here. This is a brief summary of all the different paint layer structures that could be found. I selected a few different areas where I already saw different attributes with a microscope. So, and then I made bigger. I selected different areas, and all this might look overly complicated at first, but all these paint layers can be categorized in 3 main working phases. The initial phase includes the original images visible through the infrared imaging, along with the underlying priming and paint layers. The 4 coat of arms panels I've shown you earlier show off this phase 2. The second phase comprises the current images visible without aids and with the naked eye, as well as the initial layers added at the same time. Lastly, there's a third phase. This phase encompasses later alterations. The third phase includes a thick layer of green paint on the outer edge of the panel, a thick layer of gold paint on the inner ring, and the varnish over the whole panel. These changes were presumably made to enhance the panel's aesthetic. In order to recognize these areas, a wide variety of investigations was carried out, but also simply logical thinking, like the very existence of a varnish on this object was in a historical context is questionable in a historical context, as it was the object was constantly changing. So you wouldn't apply a varnish over an unfinished object normally. And especially the third phase is crucial in the conceptualization process. By defining these layers, the important question of the authenticity of the panel and its paint layers arose. The original substance and the traces of past use play a crucial role in preserving the authenticity of an artwork. When developing criteria for accepting modification phases in restoration project, it is important to carefully evaluate the impact of any changes and the artwork's authenticity and historical significance. By balancing the need to preserve the original integrity of the artwork with the necessity of addressing damage or deterioration, restoration efforts can ensure that the artwork maintains its authenticity while also being appropriately preserved for future generations. The authenticity of an artwork is a key consideration in conservation and restoration, in this case particularly when determining criteria for accepting the modification phases. With phase 1 and 2, there's a straightforward evidence of authenticity and originality. You can even see different working phases in phase 2 itself. There are many pictures added over time, and you can clearly see the working progress with different art styles, for example. With phase 1 being below phase 2, it's obvious that this phase can also be considered as authentic as well. With phase 3, the authenticity question gets a little harder due to the fact that there's clear evidence that it was added at a later time. But shouldn't it still be considered authentic? Just because it's there and it is a part of the object's history? And if we want to show as much authenticity and leave all the traces of the past, wouldn't this mean that working phase 3 should be left where it is, even though it covers up other phases partially? This is why it's especially important to talk about which changes can be considered as valid alterations to keep in the future. And what do these changes contribute to the object? And is there a story behind them that has a positive impact on the object, for example? These questions really make you think about what we consider as authentic. It's also important to consider the original intention behind the object. Even though it's not very clear and there's not a lot of information behind this, it is safe to assume that the aesthetic value as a decorative object is one of the intentions of the object. So why would it be more important to save the third working phase, that is altering the aesthetic value, than to restore the original creative vision of the coat of arms panel? By considering and discussing all these questions and getting many opinions on it, a decision was made. In the end, we decided to restore phase 2 by removing phase 3, and by that restoring the initial creative vision. I have to say that, like, we can't really know what the vision was at first, but we can clearly see that, especially like the very yellowed varnish, wasn't really intended. This step was considered more important than conserving the changes that phase 3 made. The most important arguments were that these changes were clearly made in a modern time and were not executed well. It's also restricted the visual aspect of the panel by, for example, dulling the colors by the varnish. By deciding to remove phase 3, it was made possible to remove the yellow varnish and thus revive the overall paint and make it bright again. Here you can see clearly where the varnish is halfway off here on the right side, and how it changes the whole images, and everything just looks brighter here. We were also able to remove the green and the gold layers of paint, which is not shown here, but I will show you in a later slide. And by removing the green and the gold layers, there was a fully intact other gold layer beneath it. Here you can see the initial state again, so it's in your mind again, and this is what the panel looks like now. Even if it was an extremely lengthy process, the removal of phase 3 was highly successful, and now the initial aesthetic vision of the panel is visible again, and we can imagine what it looked like a few years ago, a few hundred years ago maybe. In conclusion, the restoration of the coat of arms panel serves as a testament to the importance of ethical decision-making in conservation practices. By prioritizing the authenticity, historical significance, and the artistic integrity, we can ensure that cultural artifacts like the panel are preserved with respect and care. Yeah, thank you for your attention, and if you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Henning?
I'm here. Thank you,
Yeah.
Anna-Lena, for sharing your findings from your examination, the decision-making, and the treatment of this unusual object with us. We now have a short question and answer session. Again, there are quite a few questions in the chat. May I ask our speakers, Katherine and Anna-Lena, to turn on their microphone only when we address a question to you. Okay, let's start. So the first question is for Katherine.
Exactly. And well, the first question comes from Andreas. He says, thank you very much. And did you check the wood species, especially the poplar wood? If yes, how did you do that? Katherine,
I'm sorry,
are you
could
with us?
repeat the question? Yes.
Yes,
Can you hear
of
me?
course. Yes, I can hear you. Of course, I can repeat it. So thank you very much for your presentation. And did you check the wood species, especially the poplar wood? If yes, how did you do that?
Thank you so much for the question. We did not check for the wood species of the panel. The wood analysis occurred out of house, so I worked with my supervisor, Jess, to take the samples of both the panel and the relief, and then we opted for more broader information on the wood analysis as opposed to specific species. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Andreas is, did you follow a special system of summarizing and sorting the many investigation results?
Thank you again for the question. The system that I followed for organizing the information obtained for from the technical study, it was based off of a prior report that my supervisor, Jessica Koros, did while she was a graduate student interning at the Gardner Museum. And what I did was I made a very brief summary of all of my findings for all of the different results, and that was about probably three to 4 pages, and then I cited appendixes for each of the individual tests. So all of the raw data is there, so someone can reference it, and all of that data is housed in charts with summaries and descriptions of what either the spectra or the cross-section says. But if someone is short on time, they can just read my summary pages, and that could hopefully do the trick. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. I think that were all the questions for Katherine. Henning?
Yeah, I am here. Don't worry. So thank you, Kiki. Now some questions for Anna-Lena. So there are a number of different ones, some return concerning the original overpainting. So would you know why the earlier depictions were overpainted?
That's just speculations, but I interpret it as that the layer beneath was already filled up. So every single space where there could be painting, like a little image edit, that was filled up, and that's what we saw under the infrared, with the infrared imaging, that it was just everything, there was no blank spaces. So we thought that it was just a practical thing, that they didn't have to build like a whole new wooden panel to paint on, but they just overpainted the whole first layer, so, and then added a new layer so they could add new imaging.
Okay, so then there's another question that's actually for me. I might have missed it. How large is this object, the panel or shield?
I don't know it exactly, but I think it's about 80 centimeters in diameter. It's not a perfect circle, but around that 80 centimeters, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, okay, well, that's good. So there are now some questions with regard to the removal of the layer 3 or phase 3. So what was the opinion of the owner regarding the removal?
The owner actually was very supportive about the removal, and the owner really kind of at the beginning wanted more removed than I did, because I was having my a little bit of concern at first, because it's a big step to just remove a whole paint layer, but now I really came around, and yeah, the owner just wanted it to look good again and not be as yellow, because the images were really dull and it just didn't look right. And with the green layer, you can't really see it as well on the pictures as you could see it in real life, but the green on the outer edge was just a really thick and uneven layer, and it just looked wrong. And the owner just also was really interested just in the history of the object, and to just bring back a little bit of the authenticity and put the focus on the whole object and not just on tiny details that were really irritating to the eye.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a question. There are two combined from Julia and Letizia. What did you use to remove the paint layers and how did you do it?
First, I started to just test out with sorbents how the different paint layers and the varnish solved, and surprisingly, all of them were only solvable in ethanol, and the layers below, they were mostly oil paint, so it didn't interfere with these layers, and I used some textile material to put on that I wetted a little bit with the ethanol, and then I left it on there for a few minutes, depending on which area I was on, because the varnish just solved in the really quickly, but especially like the green outer edge that I also had to remove, that took like sometimes 10 minutes on there, and then I had to do multiple rounds just to remove the green because it was such a thick layer. But yeah, thankfully it all worked out and nothing below was damaged or lost in the process.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Kiki and Anna-Lena, for your questions, for your answers, your presentations. And if there should be more questions, we will send them to you.
Yes, and this brings us to the end of the fifth and final ConNext session of 2024. I would like to thank again our keynote speaker, Anke Scharrahs, and a big thank you to Tjabbe Nijs, Caro van Mierlo, Katherine Peters, Anna-Lena, Korsten. Before we officially close this great conference, I would like to take a moment to thank each and every one of you. Your energy and commitment have made this event special. From the inspiring presentations about mixed materials, textiles, cleaning, consolidation, and decorative surfaces, to the interesting questions and discussions, we have a lot to reflect on and take away. I encourage you all to nurture the connections made and to incorporate the knowledge gained into your studies, your research, and your path to improve conservation approaches. Let us move forward together with the knowledge we have shared here and support each other. To our keynote speakers, thank you for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and your challenges. Your presentations were not only a transfer of knowledge, but also an inspiration for all of us, pushing us to think deeper and strive harder towards our respective endeavors.
And we would also like to thank our institutes and partners, especially Sophie and Vincent. This conference could not have taken place without you. And I would also like to add a thanks to all colleagues who have reviewed your abstracts, developed the conference program, invited the keynote speakers, and collected the audience questions so effectively in the background. And of course, not least, you, the audience, for making this event happen. Since we have just finished the final session of our fourth edition, that means that next year will be our fifth anniversary. This asks for a special edition, and we are turning ConNext 2025 into a live event. No guarantees. More information on ConNext 2025 and a call for abstracts will follow in the autumn. Until then, we wish you a good summer break, and we'll see you when we ConNext again. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Sorry Wilmoet, ik ga je er ook uit gooien. Tot later. I kicked everybody out.
Ja.
Done.
Okay. Are we alone?
Yes. No, I kicked them all out.
Well
Last
done,
word.
Great.
well done, everyone.
Yes, thank you all.
I just grabbed a glass of wine, so cheers to us all.
Yeah, I grabbed water. I'm sorry,
Well,
but I will pretend it's something else.
Ah,
Ah,
yes. Today there were more people, more students
yeah, at the start, but we lost a lot during the break.
during the break. Yes.
Yeah, so in the end we were 39, which is less than last year. But the weather is beautiful. I think that also makes a difference, maybe.
So we should do it in winter then. Move it
No,
to
I was
winter. ConNext.
No, well, I had a meeting with Vincent earlier today, where we talked about the future of ConNext.
Bye.
Oh,
I just
you're
had
leaving,
to get-
Henning?
I had to get something. Oh, the camera's on.
And because we already we talked about it, we have contact every now and then we already mentioned maybe turning it into a live event next year, because we exist 5 years, and if we really want our students, put our students together, it only works in real life. But it takes a lot of effort and planning, scheduling, and also the financial aspect is something that we need to be aware of, because it needs to be accessible to everyone. But that's something that we would like to discuss next time we meet. That will be in a few weeks or so, after everything is sunk a bit.
We are still recording, right?
Oh yes, yeah, but that's something we can